Hey folks, welcome back to day 16 of Basic Design. Today, I kind of wonder how many times I say this. Today is a fun day. We get to introduce a new project. If you're thinking through the things we've looked at through all the different projects, where we're going, adding into complexity, one of the major things we haven't covered yet is the use of words, specifically lettering and typography in the realm of the field of graphic design. But we're looking at how we can use letter forms in order to express more precise things than what we can do with color and focal point and background and line and shape and all these different things that we've talked about so far. As you can see with my course structure, we're building blocks all the way up to a large level of complexity. This is the second to last project, and the final project, which you'll probably have less of these videos then, because we've talked about most of the course content. It's all practice then. We develop a project that uses all of them together into one cohesive whole. We separate them all out to look at them. So let me switch to this other shared screen. I've got some documents that I use. The first is this. We start off with what I think is a fun exercise. It's frequently the students get involved in it, and it is like a game, but you can see some spec sheets for different typefaces. These are very popular typefaces that are on almost all computers. Well, not all of them are on all computers, but I give each group, I break them up into groups of 2 or 3, depending on the class size, and I give them an N, an O, and an H from a typeface. Then using tracing paper, they need to use those 3 letters to try to create the rest of the alphabet, the capital uppercase alphabet, and they don't get to see it. So you get to see it because this is a video and you're not in my class. After about 5 or 10 minutes, I have them talk and say, you can get one more letter. What is the thing you want to, like, what is the letter you want? What letters are difficult for you to make without those parts? The reason I do this exercise, which it's a lot of fun, it takes some time, it's a couple of things. One, with the structure that I have, I'm not doing design training, like graphic design training. So taking a typography class and doing things like drawing letters by hand with ink or with gouache or something like that is not very common, and it's not something I do. I do think it's valuable, especially in an appreciation of letter form. So people who are like really into this, you should do that. Go out and take a letter, blow it up, and try to draw it like 12 inches by 12 inches as smoothly and beautifully as possible. You will get a better appreciation of what these typographers are doing. But for the case, for what I'm trying to get at, I'm trying to develop the notion that there is an anatomy of typefaces. If you look at what we've done throughout the class, so much of it is going through the creative process of exploration, refinement, critiquing, analyzing your critique, and circling around. And so much of what we talked about is unity versus variety, or how we can have unity and elements of variety. All of that is what a typographer must do. I use a video of Jonathan Hoffler and I forget the name of his former partner, Tobias Freer-Jones, it's like a short documentary where they go through their process briefly. If you're interested in more of this, you should watch a Netflix documentary series called Abstract. In the 2nd season has a episode with Jonathan Hoffler. It is great. But they go through this process of what do they do to design, and they are constantly using words like, we're trying to get the feel or the underlying idea of a typeface. That's the unity. And they're trying to deal with the eccentricities that you have to work with, especially in the realm of the Latin alphabet that we use. Things like, look at that Q. Look at how the Q changes over time in different typefaces to do different things and to serve different purposes. You know, we have like 5 different varieties between 6 typefaces here. Or look at the way, you know, from a P to an S, how they change subtly. Look at the direction of the S's. I like this one. And this is one of my favorite P's where it doesn't actually connect. There's all of these little eccentricities that are giving the flavor. And one of the things I like to talk about is how this developed from, you know, over time from all kinds of written language technologies, starting with pictograms. You know, the capital A that we see at some point was actually the other direction, and it was an image of a bull's head. the D for door was, or for door, I already told you, the D was a symbol, a pictogram for door. And you can see it kind of like this, but it initially was like this because the door frame had a flap of leather that hung over it. So there were these little drawings, and slowly over time they get associated with sounds. And, there's all kinds of theories about how language developed. Personally, I enjoy the ones that think about the development of language as being taken from music. And they're used in a variety of different ways. And they start to become, eccentric and nuanced here and there. And we've inherited these things. So I like to talk about, I have them think through and look at the anatomy in the exercise to then look more closely and to begin to ask questions. And then I lecture on what is the anatomy? Where do these things come from? They're intrinsically tied to our human experience, which is like what I'm constantly trying to get the students these days to remember, is that in order to design for people, you need to understand how people perceive things. In order to think about how to use certain words and letters, you should think about their past and how they've been used before. We are not these isolated individuals, we're interconnected. So when we look at this, I like to, just start off, what is a baseline? So I'm not going to do it as much in this video, but I ask all these in questions and see if the students can elucidate and elicit it. I know some of them get annoyed because they think I'm fishing for answers. I'm actually just trying to get them to think and be a human being. Baseline is the letters all sit on a base. This comes out of the invention of typography. So where did typography come from? Johannes Gutenberg invents movable type through the printing press. Coming out of his Protestant, the Protestant Reformation, believing that everyone should have a Bible, and he's trying to deal with, and so he's trying to deal with this problem of what the Lutherans thought about the Bible, and he is noticing these different ways he can bring these things together to make movable type. So each little piece of letter form was on its own little block, and he put them in cases and organized them. So he had a bunch of F's and a bunch of lowercase f's, and you can imagine, where would you store the lowercase f's? Oh, maybe they got a name because they were in the lowercase and the capitals were in an uppercase. I don't know why, but that's how it slowly evolved. So you have your uppercase and your lowercase, and you have all these things so that you don't have to carve a new piece of wood for every single page. You've got these letters that you just arrange, line up, and then print. And then you can take them out of the press, rearrange them, and print the next page, or 1,000 copies of each page. So it's this major advent that, people tried to write in straight lines and whatnot, but generally, if you've ever written by hand, like I mentioned with the palette last week, your arm generally curves. It's very hard. And you hold a pen at an angle, which we'll talk about that in a moment. But there's all kinds of things that happen that once it becomes mechanized, it's much easier if you standardize it. And so you create a baseline. This is the line in which all the letters sit on. Now, in the Latin alphabet, that's difficult because we've got these things called descenders. The way that handwriting evolved made it so that several letters we frequently tucked under other ones. And some, like the ascender we have here, went over other ones. But I'm jumping ahead. We've got the cap height. This is the general height of capital letters. We got the X height. This is a fun one because, it reminds students of, like, in kindergarten, in America at least, generally, and all of my students still had this happening. They've got those little documents that have the lines and then the dotted line in the middle, and so you learn to draw your letters in there. And so some of them are like, it's the height of the lowercase letter. I'm like, well, why is it called X height then? That's where I like to go back to this one. Thinking about the lowercase x, it is one of the more condensed, but also it's kind of like generally it's going to be a square. So it becomes like the standard size of lowercase letters. If you look between the uppercase and the lowercase letters, the uppercase letters have way less variation. There's still variation, but there's less. Look at the width of them all, the height, they're all pretty standardized. The lowercase letters, it's like this jumble of shapes, which is helpful, by the way, for reading. That's why reading it's easier to read lowercase than it is to read uppercase, but, whatever. I do talk about that. Maybe I'll talk about it on here, but anyways. So the X height becomes this standard for how you can think about where the lowercase will be. We have other things like stems and bowls and serifs and descenders. Ligatures are fun. How in handwriting, letters that were commonly paired together, you frequently tied into each other. If you've got, doctor handwriting, or if you write in cursive a lot, you'll see yourself doing this a lot. We've got finials and terminals and, the spines of S's, different aspects, different things that are all trying to correlate. And when you're designing these things, you have to look at the details and think back out and think about the macro and the micro over and over, trying to get at this feel. Is this the right place to put a serif? Does it need this descender? Does it need a nice finial here or something like that? And I like to point out how, again, these things respond to different historic aspects of that we've come to know and love, even though they were of the nature of it. So like the terminal and the finial are related to writing with an ink pen. An ink pen, I can kind of do this with my hand pretty easy. It has 2 points and then like a well. So imagine this is the, apparently if you do a peace sign, it puts up balloons. I hate that. That's very strange. So when you do that, you can think of it like these 2 points coming together. They're generally together in an ink pen, and when you press down, they spread apart, and the ink comes down from the well into those spaces and fills between the 2 points. And so you move it around, and you could draw and whatnot. If you're moving really fast, or like if you're starting up here, you push it down and then you slowly move away, you're going to get a little ink blot, and that's where terminals come from. It sometimes can happen, supposedly the early version of drawing an F, you started at the bottom and you came to the top and stopped. But then you can imagine you have to pick up and you have to go over to the crossbar, and that motion is less fluid. And so you'd leave a drop behind. With the E, it's a little bit like it makes more sense how it developed, because you're moving fast and you're going through the E from the middle and down around, and you move this way to your next letter. Because you're moving fast, it doesn't drop that ink. Instead, it just tapers off to a point. So we have these aesthetic qualities that functioned out of how we built or how we wrote these, how we use these letters. The same is true now as we scroll down and we look at like serifs. Serifs are a weird one. Serifs generally function because very early on in Greek and Roman Europe, they were using them by carving these letters and numbers and whatnot, because the Roman numerals were numbers initially, into buildings, into stone. You need to think about how you space your letters apart. Otherwise, you end up with, imagine, like we know the classic, I didn't think ahead, and the words curve down the side of the page. Imagine that on your, triumphal arch that you Romans plant in the city you conquered, and you write, when Caesar had this battle and what year it was and all that stuff based on your calendar because you're a conqueror. It would look really bad if everything was not nice and organized and if it was coming down the side because you didn't think ahead. Like, no, you plan accordingly. You make a system and you have these nice serifs that show you how much space needs to be standardized between each letter as best as possible. Curved letters obviously throw a loop for this, but that's in general what's happening. So the serifs were for stone carving. And the original bracketed serifs, which you can see here with the curve, frequently people think that has to do with pen and ink. It doesn't actually. It has to do with the material quality of stone. If you have an interior square like that, where the stone is sticking off in a square, it's likely it'll break as they're hammering these things out. Getting a nice internal square is hard compared to an interior square versus an exterior square, so to speak. And so all of those areas got rounded for the sake of not breaking the stone. As our technology develops, we start to make different things like hairline serifs, slab serifs in response to looking at Egypt. You can kind of see a whole history here. There's tons of videos on YouTube to see the history, but you'll see, eventually we get rid of the serifs as our technology develops to where now, especially, there's this whole thing that supposedly serif typefaces are for print and sans serif is for web. Something about readability. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if there's been any studies done on that. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. Personally, I generally don't like paragraphs that are set in sans serif typefaces. I like to read serif typefaces in paragraphs, but I read a lot. So there's a really famous thing. I don't talk too much about this in the basic class, but we read best what we read most. I believe it's a statement by Gaudi, basically saying that like you really get used to typography and you begin to develop personal taste based on your the time you've been around that, and that's why there's so much bad type in the world, is his argument. So we see all of these things in order to develop and think about how did type emerge? Why is it the way it is? Why is it so strange? I love, like, again, the students, like, I talk about this where we're not really seeing much of the world. We're constantly ignoring huge swaths of it because we make general assumptions, and we like, you need to simplify your visual realm. But even with typefaces, we generally think like, yeah, there's not very many. And it's like, I used to have 18,000 on my computer. These ones, the little details change it, and they get at that voice, which is why I love that Hoffler video. And one of the things he says is we're trying to get the underlying idea, and then we work from letters of eccentricity from there. And then sometimes it takes years to figure out because it just doesn't feel right. It's like, that's what every single typeface is, like a tone of voice. This is where it's really interesting when you think about everything we've done in the class so far kind of culminates to some degree in type design, because you're unifying sets with variety. You're using things that are gestural, like the finial, like I was talking about. You're using things that are kind of like graphic. Like, there's some really detailed letters here that derive from pictures of things. Like look at the lowercase g in this typeface here. Like, that's a lot of details for a letter. No one's teaching that letter form to kindergartners. But they're also simplifications of early pictograms. And uh, and some of them are like radically stylized, like the fact that the A is an upside down bull's face. I can't really make an upside down A. Here we go. It's like the little face and the horns right there. I didn't get balloons that time. Let's see if I can get balloons again. No. Uh, but they bring all these things together into this strange system that becomes, symbols and semiotics is the study of how these things work. Uh, that are extremely useful and powerful. The other thing about words that is really interesting in the sense of the class as a whole is that so frequently the words are the focal point of most compositions that they're included in. Not all, but most. And so they're not only the most precise mode of communication, but they're the thing where the details matter the most. If you have the details off in just a little degree, we can see that, and we know there's something wrong with it. So, for example, if you use Comic Sans instead of, Times New Romans in your essay for your, philosophy class, that professor is not going to be in a disposition to enjoy grading your paper. They're going to be set off into a disposition that's probably negative. And so they are like, I know many that would just outright reject it and say F just for that alone. This happens in, that's a big extreme, so to speak, but we can see little variations, and you can feel professionalism versus not so. Even like this typeface and this one, the fact that there's only really subtle differences. They're both serif. They're from different time frames, but one has bigger, thick aspects. One has really thin ones. They have what's called a different axis. I don't want to get into that, but that would be more for the Design 2 class. I mean, look at that 7. What a strange 7. This is some spacing issues right here, by the way. You can see when I was talking about letter spacing. Like, look at the 1 and the 2 and how close they are and how far apart the gap is from 2 to 3. If you want, this is called kerning. If you want to see some fun things online, look up bad kerning, and there's all kinds of great examples of words being ruined because they weren't spaced properly, like the Romans did. The Romans used serifs to space their letters. So the typeface is like doing all of these things coming together, and it's super useful and super powerful. They can be focal points. They can express precise ideas. That it's a great project and a fun one to introduce to the students. And then they have to make their own. So they're going to be making a typeface. We're going to be making ones that are not nearly as sort of ubiquitous as these ones are. They're going to be making ones derived from their bugs, but they're going to be doing that same process of, like, once they identify like the stem that is the vertical stroke that's going to be in all of their capital letters, like the back of the B and the D and the E and the F and the H twice and the I and the J and the K and the L and the maybe the M, maybe the R and the T. It's like that thing, whatever part of your bug drawing, that's going to be the constant thing there. And they're going to make 3 sketches of this. So they're trying to find 3 different voices that are there inside their bug that they didn't know about until they start exploring and looking for it here. So that's what this project's about. This is where I get excited in this part of the class. It starts to get far more interesting and unique. And going forward, like, it's just a lot of fun. Yeah, that's it for today. I'll see you later on Thursday.